go ahead and move on to consideration of the meeting minutes from the special meeting of April 9th, 2018. Are there any...
Mayor, I have an amendment to that.
Yes.
It just says that I was dialed in by phone on that one, and I just like to have it amended that I was actually here that night.
Okay. Well, that would be kind of an unimportant point. Okay. Are there any other amendments? Is there a motion to approve the minutes as presented with the notation that Alderman Matthey was actually here?
I'll make that motion.
Oh, yes.
I'll make the motion that we accept.
I'm sorry. I thought you said you had a question. I'll make you're moved by Alderman Matthey. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alderwoman Bray. Any further discussion or corrections? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you call the roll? Me?
I think she was saying call the roll too, though.
And I was just asking if you were going to vote. Electronically vote.
Oh, we can? Okay. I have been asking you to call the... let's just go ahead and vote then electronically. Okay. It's not... There it is. Okay. All right, there we go. 9-0. No nays to announce, Madam Clerk. Motion carries. All right, the minutes will stand as amended. Next, we move with presentation with updates by Green Play and Company for the Comprehensive Parks and Recreation Master Plan as requested by the Parks and Recreation Cultural Arts Department. And we're going to go ahead and turn this over to Mr. Tesloff, who's already here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this time this evening. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to hand over pretty much the time to Dylan from Green Play. But wanted to give you kind of overall, this is kind of a year-long process. I've told these guys over and over, I don't want to do it fast, I want to do it right. And what we're seeing here are the recommendations, draft recommendations the guys brought back after listening to all of you, staff, citizens. So this is where we are. This is focused on the comprehensive master plan. If you remember, the last comprehensive plan was approved in 97, with the latest update being in 2009, 2010. But we understand this is the financial issues we are having. There's going to be no funding necessarily linked to this, but we want to have our roadmap going forward so we know as funding becomes available. As I've told you guys many times, I'm looking for grants, alternative money all the time. So as money comes up, we want to be able to implement this plan. So one of the things that I liked when I saw the first draft of recommendations from these guys is a lot of these we've started. That we're implementing some of these before we even heard what the recommendations were. So that was rewarding for our staff to see us moving forward with some of the recommendations that that these guys are bringing forward. So with that, I'll let Dylan have the rest of the time.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I was back, or Dan and I were here in the last time, I believe, in October. To present to you guys the findings of where we were and the process that we went through. Since that time, or in that time frame, we have done some background planning with the O'Neill Park Master Plan. We've done some planning with the Recreation Center, feasibility and background work with that. But today I really want to focus on as Jay said, the comprehensive plan of this, just so we can get all of these planning processes wrapped up to a degree, and we want to make sure that we have your buy-in and acknowledgement of the framework again as we move through this. So this isn't necessarily what the final recommendations will say. It's not the entire conversation. The comprehensive plan will probably be something close to about a 100-page document, depending on what staff decides is kind of the most useful information to be in the body versus into an appendix. But a lot of the appendix will be things like the survey results, finalized trends and demographics reports, some of the public input process that we had presented earlier. There's a thing called a GRASP Atlas, which is an inventory process that we went through, so the physical layout of your parks, the analysis. So there's a lot of information that goes into this, and again, as Jay said, this is just the overall theming or the overall process. So when you see these recommendations, know that there's, in the draft report that you'll see later on, there is going to be full analysis of each of the recommendations or themes in those recommendations, and then also strategic actions within those recommendations. So when we look at something in a 30,000-foot view, how can staff best implement it? Dan was here about a month ago to go through that process with staff to help us shape those recommendations to be a customized plan for Bloomington. Just a reminder of the planning process that we went through. So we started about a year ago. Spoke to many of you on the phone or face-to-face when we were here to do the initial information gathering. At the same time, we did a inventory and level of service analysis. So we had a landscape architect and data collection firm out in the park system to really look at what GRASP is. And you'll see GRASP as a term in this recommendation process, and really what that is a components-based inventory. So instead of a traditional parks-based inventory or acres-based inventory that you see a lot in parks and recreation spaces, we do it based on components. So rather than grassland acres, we look at things like trailheads and playgrounds and park benches, so it gives a different quantitative score. So GRASP just defines that component-based inventory as we go through this. We were here in October to present basically Phase 1 and Phase 2 to you to see the different types of information that we needed. How do we finish out the survey? How do we synthesize the data? And how do we look for different opportunities in the analysis to really complete the picture of Bloomington Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Arts. And then now we're kind of at this draft recommendations phase. We've gone through our analysis. We've gone through some of the background research, and now we want your buy-in so that we can finish analysis and then turn around a draft document to staff, who will then give it their red pen, send it back to us, we'll send it back to staff, and then hopefully it comes to you guys as a completed final draft for approval is our goal with that. You do see the O'Neill Park Master Plan and the Recreation Center feasibility study on the right side of this screen. I do want to acknowledge that those were going on while we did this, but again, today kind of focuses in on that comprehensive plan recommendations and themes as we move forward. Without just reading these off to you, I know that you have them in front of you. I want to spend some time acknowledging that staff, again, as Jay said, a lot of these have already started being implemented. I told them today that when we come into work with communities, we tend to see the Parks and Recreation Department as the professionals or as the experts in the community, and so oftentimes they're already in tune with what the community is seeing. And if we're pulling recommendations or we're finding things where people are really surprised by results, then there's really issues. If we are finding recommendations that are heard about or that the department is kind of proactively planning for, we're really excited about them being really in tune with the organization or them being really in tune with the community. So I think it's a credit to Jay and his staff about how in tune with the community they are, that none of this information should be really shocking. The implementation here and there, given the different circumstances of the general areas, it's kind of where we can come in and help with defining a new solution to a problem. So this first phase of these recommendations is really about the ongoing existence of partnerships and looking at how can you proactively plan and communicate with the other providers that are in the area. Most users don't necessarily care who provides the service; they care that the service is provided. And so, it's not necessarily, in our opinion, Bloomington's responsibility to provide all recreation services in the area, but it is the responsibility of our department to influence. Okay, and so how does that best happen? And so you see these kind of overarching recommendations moving forward about looking at things like intergovernmental agreements and policy moving forward on that. So again, when we look at these recommendations, there's going to be a more analysis within the body of the document, and then strategic actions within those recommendations as well. Okay. So we look at the overall park recommendations. One of the things I think is kind of a big theme of this is looking at the variety in park destinations, looking at the GRASP analysis, and so it might be something that changes the way of thought a little bit, but not necessarily the total direction of where the community was going beforehand. So just maybe a different way to think about what the park system looks like. We generally want to see that parks are starting to establish themselves or have their own identity within a system to create their overall system. The GRASP analysis looks at the components, a person's access to components around their community. There's two different analyses. One was done as just a general neighborhood access, and another one was a walkability score of about 1/3 of a mile. One of the things that makes GRASP unique is we also add in barriers. So we consider that anything that you wouldn't send your child across. So rail tracks, Veterans Parkway, things like that. And so you'll see in those maps and those graphics that there's a bubble around there's bubbles around parks, and then there's hard lines that are drawn through those and just kind of cut off from those, just as our general assessment of what a barrier is. Really, it's providing the department a tool to make that decision. Is it necessary to remove the barrier with a bridge or a crosswalk or something like that, or is it more appropriate to develop something else in that area? So again, we're looking at as the community develops, how can you guys best proactively plan for that type of situation? Again, it's not. It does highlight areas just based on the threshold that's in there, but it doesn't necessarily identify a parcel that you were recommending acquisition for or anything like that. Okay. Is there questions on that?
Questions from the council members? I think you can proceed then.
Okay, cool. So this is one of a great example of what we try to look for when we try to engage with the community. When we went out, this is part of the survey. Some of these survey processes are brought right into our recommendations. Again, the more narrative will be brought into the analysis of that. But looking at how do you upgrade the current system, I don't know if I made that clear enough on the previous slides. Our recommendations are really about how do you take what you have and then show in good faith to the community that you're moving forward, regardless of financial situation or regardless of kind of the environment that you live in. How do you make the tangible changes to what you have to really highlight, or what's the low-hanging fruit opportunity? Some of those things are things like explore fitness stations for equipment on like loop trails or things like that. Fitness is obviously a huge growing trend in parks and recreation, as is being outdoors and trying to find those. You look at some of the other pieces that showed up pretty high on the survey results. Water access in the community is another big and growing trend. So this list here is from the survey. Excuse me. And then this second list, consider the new trend, so dog park, skateboarding. It's not our recommendation to put a dog park in every park or put water access in parks that don't have water. It's our recommendation that you can either choose to influence how dog parks are provided in your community and where those are provided, and then or provide them yourself. So you look at this list, these are big growing trends in the community. I know when we did our information gathering here, a gathering area was desired, is wanted. And so when you look at this, when you look at the last list of what people want compared to, the list of growing trends, you can start to kind of prioritize what types of spaces, if you were going to develop components of the system, that you can highlight and prioritize moving forward. Okay. Some of the other recommendations, so like this recommendation on here is a good example of develop a program of standardized park site furnishings, is really about creating administrative processes and systems in place that helps you cycle the lifetime of your park system assets, but then also create a tracking system so that I think the next slide has life cycle on here. So when you start to use similar materials and you start to track that, you can also track lifetime and then get into kind of deferred maintenance budgeting. And just so it's really just trying to bring in the conversation of like smart business practices into developing park conversations. I do want to point out the ADA standards and accessible design is really it's not the recommendation to say you guys are non-compliant. It's our recommendation to say continue to do it moving forward, just as a way to protect you guys if an audit does happen. Having an approved plan with recommendation of continuing to update as you can is just due diligence on our part. I think we covered this. One of the things, a little bit of the central location on Ewing Park was talked about a little bit by the staff, and understanding that it's not really a geographically central location, but when you look at where population lives in the community, it becomes a high density walkable access park location. So one of the recommendations in there is looking at that gathering space, not necessarily in downtown, but maybe where the population has access, a high number of population has access to it moving forward. I should also say that when we look at these recommendations or these opportunities, we aren't also saying do them all tomorrow. This will also come with somewhat of a prioritized list of maybe you tackle these in the first 3 years. If you can't tackle, if you get through that list, maybe there's the next list type of thing. So this isn't all do these tomorrow, do these right away. It's we'll go through the process of looking at opportunities that might not be super important, and I think in the next couple of slides you'll see what I'm talking about, kind of in a better example. These are looking at the trail issues, so the same GRASP analysis was basically done with on trail shed and access, so where people live to how they can access trails, and then connectivity was analyzed. The recommendation at the bottom is kind of a great example of the update what you already have, right? How do you include signage, or how do you upgrade the trail system without a whole lot of added cost or development? And some of those things are those fitness stations, or on this one it's trail signage and wayfinding to look at moving forward. So this is a great example of the not right now conversation. We did do as a part of this planning process, we did recreational indoor facilities. I think it's a no-brainer that indoor space in Bloomington for the public access is limited on a recreational level. It's called for in the 2014 City of Normal Plan to do a recreation center feasibility study. Jay obviously had parts of that incorporated into this plan. So I think this is a great conversation of saying, hey, a recreation center is probably a not right now conversation. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at how to improve the programming that would happen within a rec center. And so here's another section that when we look at indoor facilities, we're talking about the four walls, and then when we look at programming, we're talking about what's happening in the four walls. And so how programming then becomes maybe a right now or priority recommendation, knowing that you're not building a recreation center, but you can still influence how programming happens within the community. And so this section will look at the opportunities to, partner with programmers, invest or divest from programming, different opportunities, that we see along the way. We also actually did a grasp analysis of some alternative providers in the community as well, so you can kind of see where more higher density of alternative providers exists than where not in the community.
And by grasp, would that have included something like the Y? Because we know that at some point they'll be vacating their current facility.
Yeah, it was done.
And they have a pool. It's designed.
Yeah, it was done with the existing facility, but not. It was completed about 6 months ago, so I don't know if them moving was necessarily in the conversation at that time. Mm-hmm. But certainly something that can, again, kind of grasp provides the avenue to have that discussion. You can assumedly see the map and move kind of the level of service, assuming where the YMCA would go.
Thank you.
Another big opportunity, you guys do a lot of special events already. People want more. That's just a huge trend in Parks and Recreation. The opportunity for more, you guys would kind of ties back into that Ewing Park idea of you probably need a bigger space if you're providing larger community events, and so how do you implement that moving forward? Again, not a right this second opportunity, but something to look for as funding becomes available. Then we did a financial is some of the background stuff that we did. Determine the appropriateness of partners and sponsors. We're giving we did a funding exercise with Jay and Eric where we identified things of, what you guys currently do, what you could do, what's off the table, and then try to prioritize looking at those. Cost recovery study is just the idea of, looking at, again, kind of one of those best practices from business, looking at direct expense and direct revenue and how do you most appropriately balance tax supplementation with the ability to recover cost. And then the marketing and the communication and service delivery, again, also comes from the public input of, people are always looking for more information. What are the best avenues for that? That was a question that was asked on the survey. But then also kind of the service delivery of like evaluating the scheduling. So this evaluating scheduling for programs to accommodate a wider range of participants is something like if you provide a basketball program at 5 o'clock, are you also providing something for the parent to do instead of the example we talked about was sitting on a bench and texting? Are you providing that parent something to do at the same time? So starting to evaluate some of those scheduling opportunities moving forward. And then, as we said, our next steps would be to give staff a document to run through, say, hey, this won't work, can we switch it, or this priority is off, can we switch it, and then try to get you guys a full document, and a full document would have this comprehensive plan information, the finalized O'Neill Park plan, and then the recreation feasibility study conversation, either in the document or in an appendix conversation, depending on how that shifts out. So basically today, again, we're kind of presenting to you what the overall direction has become of the document and really want your input on what you want to see in some of these recommendations, or what pieces or highlights of these recommendations you want more information on, just so we can, when we present a document to staff, we have best kind of best direction moving forward, knowing that we're also presenting you with the same document at the end of it. So that's all I have for a presentation. If you guys want any questions or input, we're kind of here for you.
Okay. All right. Council members, questions, comments, feedback?
I have a question.
Alderwoman Schmidt.
I think these are process questions. So the O'Neill feasibility study, that comes to us as a separate document?
So the goal with that was, originally, the goal was to have that as a chapter within this comprehensive plan. I think that's still the goal, but it happens a little bit separately. So the comprehensive plan might just address overall opportunities at O'Neill Park, but it'll have its own probably section or chapter that is the O'Neill Park master plan. So hopefully they can be approved at the same time. They don't necessarily have to be, though. Is that, Jay, do you have? Yeah. They were concurrent planning processes that were meant to be both separate and the same. So if they don't happen to be the same, they're not reliant on each other.
I see. Thank you. And do you provide sort of ballpark financials around some of these? Like suppose we added fitness stations in our trails, for example.
Yeah.
Do you help us understand how we might layer those into our budget?
Yeah, so the Atlas is basically every park site, its GIS, the components within the park site, and then general assessments from the landscape architects of kind of the quality. It's labeled 1, 2, and 3, and so the 1s would be the lowest scoring component of the GRASP, and so we would view those as some of the low hanging fruit, and so we're working with the landscape architect to provide costs of what Sunnyside Park, if the ones were taken care of at Sunnyside Park, it might cost you in the ballpark of X, Y, and Z. So that again, being a framework of discussion, so that when you go into a budget cycle, you have your costs put out. You assumedly know what you have the ability to spend on. And then GRASP gives you the opportunity to see what sites would have the most impact, and so you can try to filter that conversation.
And then the concept behind a recreation center, where does that come from? I'm thinking about, actually it's one of your first slides where we talk about different opportunities from different agencies that may be providing some of our recreational needs. So at what point do we begin, or have we begun to talk about a recreation center? I think that's something I haven't really had on my radar.
Yeah, so I think for the basic answer to the question, it was part of our scope, and so we started looking at it just as from the start of the process. As we went through the process for the comprehensive plan, direction, 10-year strategic plan of the department. I mean, it started to be brought up by the community. I also think you look at things like the Town of Normal's master plan calls for indoor facilities in the area, and then you just kind of look at the population size as a whole, and what they want for fitness, what you currently have as indoor facilities, and in a perfect world, a recreation center would make sense, right? Not necessarily saying that you're behind by any means, or not necessarily saying that you absolutely have to have a rec center. To me, it's just a solution for indoor space that you have the ability to provide, or you would need the appropriate planning to provide the ability to have.
And I think part of what you're talking about is probably the only general indoor space we have. It's a Lincoln Leisure Center, which is hardly in great shape.
Yeah.
And do you have any idea, and maybe this is even more, I'm not just looking at you, maybe I'm kind of looking at Jay, of cities our size, roughly, what proportion do have rec centers? Because certainly it's not unusual to find a city of 4,000 or 5,000 that has a recreation center.
Right.
So what about a city of nearly 80,000?
Yeah. So I think the magic number, and I think this is very broad, very broad generalization, is that at some point the recreation industry would talk about every 60,000 people would have a rec center. If you're in Colorado, it's like every 20 to 25,000. So I mean, it kind of depends, but you guys are kind of at that growth level, and then if you add the town of Normal into the Blono population area, you're a pretty big population center. To then also not have a recreation center, just in a very general, broad sense, not to say that it's a dire need or anything like that, or it's not inappropriate, or it's not appropriate not to have one. So, Dan, you have, 60,000 was always kind of the...
That's what I would say,
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the community and that need, what you have in place, what opportunities are out there, private sector as opposed to the public sector as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Sorry. Alderman Sage, and then Milawambwe and Burgess.
Thank you. You touched on this point earlier in your comments, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but I'd like for you to expand on it a little bit. And this idea that making sure a service is available in a given area is not the same thing as making sure that each individual entity in that area might be offering that service. You put more emphasis on making sure the service was available and less on who provided it.
Right.
So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that. Do a little deeper dive into that.
Yeah, I think it really depends on, the philosophy of the community. And so what our general philosophy as a company is that we promote the idea that the government is in place to provide for service gaps, to make sure that people aren't missing out on a service. And it's most appropriate for us in the public space to provide that opportunity. So in a recreation sense, and I'm not saying this is the example in Bloomington, but it's an easy example. When you look at things like, we'll say, youth baseball. And so on a youth baseball level, there will always be a pay-to-play component, and that component is actually growing, right, in the service industry. But there are also opportunities for families that don't necessarily have the ability to pay into that. And it's not necessarily there are certainly communities that their pay-to-play system fills those service gaps. But if those service gaps aren't available, then we think that the Parks and Rec department has the obligation to start to fill those types of needs. So that maybe in an ideal space, the recreational services for kids 3 to 5 is provided by the rec department. And if children at the age of 7 decide they want a higher level of service, they would go into the kind of that pay-to-play system. I don't think there's a need or a desire for recreation to really be in competition with that, because at the end of the day, a pay-to-play system has the ability to continuously reinvest in itself rather than spread its resources to other things like parks maintenance. Right, and so there's always going to be some sort of overlap. Right, there's always going to be some overlap, but we also see the recreation system as almost the first step into experiencing. And if people choose to want a higher level of service, then the private sector is generally the more appropriate service provider. Yep.
Alderman Milawambwe, and then Burgess.
Thank you. So I was trying to understand what a rec center would have in it, and this is, in a way, it's kind of a similar question to what Alderman Sage was asking, because I see a lot of different facilities in the community. ISU has some, Wesleyan has some, and then you have other private providers as well. So I kind of, when you say indoor, being a soccer person, I'm thinking indoor, indoor soccer. But I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that, what that would entail.
A recreation center?
Right, recreation center, indoor facility. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so there's big components of a rec center that, when we do surveys and things like that, generally are like the major categories. It's fitness space, which is free weights and classroom space. It's classroom space, so things to do like skill building or educational classrooms, things like that, arts programming. There's generally a community area, whether that's a community gathering space in the center or a rental meeting hall type thing. Those could be flex spaces to have. You can have a large room divided by 3 to have those kind of multi-purpose classrooms. It's an aquatics area. It's a gymnasium. And then if you want to get really wild, you can start adding on kind of the supplemental things. So things that are new and growing, the indoor space. You guys are a winter community or a cold community in the wintertime, and people want safe access to walking. And so do you provide an indoor track space, a loop track, to provide that opportunity? Ice. Sheets of ice are big here in Colorado. There's a rec center that has 2 or 3 sheets of ice in it. Certainly not something that is cheap, but it's certainly demanded by that community. And so to me, that's kind of what the idea is. I would push back a little bit on the idea of like a 24-hour fitness or the ISU fitness facility being the same. I think the programming space in a rec center is so uniquely dynamic that yes, fitness and gym activities happen in a rec center, but it's not necessarily the core of what's happened, of everything that's happening within a rec department or within its rec programming. And then kind of that fitness conversation is similar to what Alderman Sage's conversation was. Most often we find that people experience fitness at the rec center, and if they decide they want a higher level of service, will go to the private industry. So we generally find that the communities that have the strongest public facilities also have the strongest private facilities as well, because it establishes it basically as a entry level market position for a new user to then go experience the private industry on a higher level.
Thank you.
Alderwoman Burgess.
Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your final report. But I just had a question about the overall park recommendations and the GRASP study findings. When you talk about population density and level of service per acre and population per acre, I don't think I caught it. When you say per acre, are you talking about acres of park or acres of community?
Acres of park.
Okay. And so when you say we're in the bottom half in terms of level of service and population per acre, are you talking about, I just want to make sure I understand, are you talking about just the services we offer in our parks, or are you saying we're also below average when it comes to the acreage of parks that we provide in our community compared to other communities?
Yes. So other communities that have gone through GRASP, your threshold is a little bit lower. That's not to say that's not appropriate. Right? Like, it's totally appropriate for that number to be lower than somebody else's. And I think that's also a decision to make moving forward, whether you want to increase or decrease the level of service. There's no standard level of service that Bloomington, Illinois needs to provide based on their population. We generally like to say if your community is satisfied, which your community is very satisfied, and it's sustainable, then you're probably providing an appropriate level of service. If things become unsustainable or your community becomes dissatisfied, then that's the opportunity to either increase or decrease that level of service. But looking at your own system and creating that benchmark, I think a lot of this is trying to put in those business practices of, here's where you are in 2018. Let's reevaluate in 2020. Are we at the same position with level of service that we wanted to be at, or have we improved, have we declined? And so benchmarking against yourself, I think, is the most important piece of that conversation, not necessarily here's where you fit with somebody else and so it's wrong. Right?
And just in terms, one of the things that would concern me would be those who, in terms of the community, that would ask for whatever they might ask for, would be those who are not necessarily voiceless, but effectively voiceless, or don't necessarily know that they need it.
Right.
When I was a kid after elementary school, I lived in a community of 7,000 people that had a recreation center. Now, it was built of aluminum, but it was a place where everybody went, and it was a pretty conservative and not very wealthy community, and they had a rec center.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that they did that is they wanted to make sure that kids had somewhere to go, especially in summer, and especially kids who are somewhere between 10 and 18.
Yeah.
So they're less likely to get into trouble, and that they're less likely to get caught up in a system. And I mean, there are many other kinds of benefits to rec centers. The economic analysis that exists on the benefits of rec centers, have been out there for 35 or 40 years. Anyway, Alderman Black and then Bray.
I think Alderman Bray was first. You can go first.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work on this and for the presentation, at least the taste and some information here. Can you talk a little bit more about the central location concept and how your study led you there? And then we're going to see more of some recommendations about a Ewing Park 3, but can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the idea of a central park is, I would say, it's a growing trend in recreation to say that people a little bit want to get out of their neighborhood and get into their community, which wasn't the case probably 15 to 20 years ago. And so you saw this like big push in recreation to build neighborhood parks and to focus on the neighborhood so people could stay within the mile. There's now a generation, mine, that wants a bigger experience, right? You see the growth of things like festivals, or you see things like these big community events that happen at centralized locations. Just looking at Ewing Park 3 came into the conversation, or Ewing Park came into the conversation when we looked at the GRASP analysis based on where the population actually lived. And so we just think that it's a good opportunity based on the mass of people that live in that area. So it's a centralized neighborhood location that if people in the community from outside of walkable access want to drive in, it also gives enough space, assumedly, for parking and a larger community event if you kind of combine those three parks into that concept. Mm-hmm.
Alderman Black.
Thank you, and thank you for going through all of this work. I know that we've crossed paths a few times. I know there's been many times you've been through the community. So, anytime I get the opportunity to engage the public, that's a really good thing. I guess my remarks at this point are going to be more focused on kind of what comes next, and I know that it was sent back to staff for recommendations. It's kind of the ask this evening. And I think at a high level, we can all sort of agree on some nebulous things that are concepts that are out there. But I think when we talk about the nuts and bolts of what a pool might look like, or what a rec center might look like, that's where we start to get some differences. So I guess this question might be more for Jay. Based on a Parks Master Plan, are we expecting to see some different pricing options for various big ticket items that we might see coming forward?
So one of the takeaways I got from when we spoke about O'Neill Pool last time was come back with 4 different options, in essence, for what we proposed outdoor, what we proposed indoor, what we currently have indoor, what we currently have outdoor. So if we were to build new, and we have those dollar amounts, I only have the cost recovery of 2 of those. Because that's probably beyond their scope in terms of we'd have to contribute if to pay them to do it more. But in terms of O'Neill, we have those 4 option pricing. So I have that information.
Okay. All right. So to that end, I guess we've seen some changes and some fluctuations in what's going on in our local economy, and we're kind of seeing how that's all going to play out over time. And I'll just say publicly that I consider Parks and Recreation to be as high of a priority as public safety, because Parks and Recreation is public safety. We've talked about some of the numbers over the years of keeping kids off the street, putting them in programs or facilities that keep them from being incarcerated or causing trouble, and I think that's very important. The interesting pieces that I'm taking away from this Parks Master Plan that I'm looking at moving forward is kind of having equity of services and equity of quality. So you can take a walk around Sunnyside or Friendship or Evergreen and do that, and then take a walk over to McGraw. There's noted difference, and I think that's functionally unfair. And I know that there's a lot of reasons why it's ended up that way, but as we talk about our Parks and Rec dollars, I think we need to be cognizant of that moving forward. I'm noticing that there's a kind of a gap in discussion regarding a multi-sports complex. I believe that's on purpose, because you didn't really hear that from this council or our focus groups.
Right. So, don't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, please.
So as the rec center conversation was going, obviously there's a feasibility study for the sports complex, and indoor space is part of that conversation. That was multiple things that we discussed as part of the focus, the main, I'm trying to think of the primary team.
Sure.
That I'm part of, and a sheet of ice, indoor turf, gym, indoor courts, and in addition to the outdoor long fields for soccer and lacrosse. All those were discussed, and the information was given to those consultants, and what they come back with is kind of where we're at right now. So that will play a lot of the feasibility study we have for the rec center, because if that goes forward, then obviously there's lots of parts of that rec center plan that we would have aren't as needed or may not be needed at all.
I follow. Thank you. And I guess to that point, when we talk about collaboration and discussions with our partners to the north or even the county, this is why I continue to think that we need to have these joint meetings where we can put some of these things on the table, so it's not just discussion that's lost in some conference room somewhere, that we actually talk about dollars and cents and what that looks like. Because at the end of the day, what I'm hearing from this group, and I share that sentiment, is that we can do these sorts of things, but we should be strategic in how we do them, because we don't want to be duplicating whatever Normal's up to, and they don't want to be duplicating what we're doing. And I think that the only way that we ever get to that point where that collaboration is real is if we're actually voting on in public together on these things, so we can create a line of sight for someone today, 5, 10, 15 years from now, because these are long-term projects, right? I mean, this isn't going to happen overnight, like you were saying earlier. And if I'm just identifying the things that I care most about, obviously O'Neill Pool is at the top of the list. I think we need to do a better job of the facility from what it is now, and we can potentially do more. But I think the Constitution Trail comes to mind as a potential collaborative effort that doesn't cost a lot of money. I think about we can all identify certain things that we think we are passionate about here. And at the end of the day, may not be strategic in that. So, like, for one, I think of like sand volleyball courts. There's two courts essentially in Clearwater Park. I'm driving 15 minutes to get out there, and those courts are packed every weekend during when it's nice. So, do we make a need somewhere else? Maybe we have some existing space, but my point being that's my opinion. But if we look at the data-driven numbers and being strategic, that's what we can start to parse out. And I guess this would be another call, as we talked with Normal about having a joint meeting, that we identify what these targets are, how we can collaborate. Hey, we'll do ice rinks if you guys do indoor soccer, whatever it is. And then so I'm looking forward to seeing the final report and staff's recommendations.
Okay. Thank you. Alderman Matthey.
Scott, that was really well said. Nicely done. I just actually wanted a bit of clarity, because I felt like Amelia asked an either-or question and you answered yes to it. So there was two parts to the question, and you answered are we below other places in terms of the GRASP analysis? But I was just curious, after she brought it up, are we below in other communities of our size in terms of total acreage of parks, and if that was something you guys looked at or not?
I could give you that answer. I don't have it with me, but I can get you that answer.
Okay, that was just, I hadn't thought about it till she asked it, and then now I wanted to know what it is. So,
okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? And just FYI, one of the topics I am having lunch with Mayor Coos on Thursday, although he's technically on leave. We know how that works. You're not really on leave. But anyway, one of the top things he wants to talk about is that. And so I may have something to report, at least from Normal's perspective. So, anything else? Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Anything else from the council?
Okay.
All right. At this point, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Moved by Alderwoman Howman. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alderwoman Painter. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, we're adjourned for 4 whole minutes, and we will start Township in 4 minutes.